Okay, so for this next video lecture, so we are in module 14. So this is entitled Audit Sampling. Okay, for the overview, so we will be discussing about the different sampling techniques that can be used by the auditor for the audit sampling in helping him during the gathering of the sufficient and appropriate audit evidences to support his opinion about the fairness of the financial statements of the client entity. So at the end of this module, you will understand the selecting items for testing, also to understand the general approaches to sampling, and as well as the uses of sampling, sample size, and audit sampling, okay, in auditing. For the contents, so we have selecting items for testing, general approaches for sampling, sampling risk, the common methods in selecting samples, uses of sampling, and the sample size. Okay, so to start with our discussion, so let us discuss about the selecting items for testing. Okay, so normally, when the auditor, when deciding or designing the audit procedures, he can choose either or a combination of the following for selecting items for testing. Okay, normally, in this case, the auditor can test a sample. Okay, as we go along, you will understand what sample or sampling is. Meaning, the auditor may not evaluate 100% or all of the transactions, the account balances, and the disclosures. So, he is allowed to evaluate and test only a portion or a percentage of that account transaction or disclosure. Okay, so although he is not able to evaluate everything, but this sample will represent, okay, the population or the overall class, okay, of those transactions, account balance, or disclosures. So he can use the following means, okay, for selecting items to be tested, okay, in gathering the audit evidences. So first, as mentioned earlier, the auditor is allowed to evaluate a portion, but he can also, if the circumstances uh, uh, will allow the auditor to select all the items for examination, meaning he can select 100%, okay, of the items, so he can evaluate everything. Okay, so here the auditor may select all items for testing when, okay, these following instances are present. Okay, first, the population or the total items constitute a small number. Okay, but although they are small number, but their value is large. Okay, so in this case, the auditor can with because in this case, auditor is limited only for a certain period of time because there is a time constraint, okay, that he has to balance as well in gathering the evidence, audit evidence, and also in preparing other things, okay, in audit. Okay, so that's why if these items constitute only a small number, so therefore the auditor can actually examine everything, okay, 100%. Second, the risk of material misstatements are high. Okay, and in this case, although the items are large, but since risk of material misstatement is high, so the auditor has no other option, and especially that in this case also other means will not provide the auditor the sufficient appropriate audit evidence. So he has no other choice but to examine everything so that he may gather sufficient appropriate audit evidence to support his opinion and also to minimize this risk of or to detect, this risk of material misstatement. Okay, another is the auditor will examine everything if the repetitive nature of a calculation or other process performed. Okay, this is performed by a computer information system. So in this case, the auditor will have the or he can perform the audit procedure efficiently and with uh, in a lesser period of time because he is aided by the computer program or software. Okay, so in that case, he is able to evaluate everything. Okay, another is 100% examination. This is often used for substantive procedures, okay, as opposed to test of controls. Meaning, the auditor um, he often uh, select items 100% in performing substantive procedures. While for test of controls, he may opt to just do sampling test. Okay, so meaning he will not be evaluating everything about internal control. So he will just take a portion, okay, of a certain area where he will test the operating efficiency of the internal controls of the entity. Okay, so that is for the first uh, procedure or means, okay, for the auditor, so he can select 100% for examination. Second, the auditor is also allowed to select specific items only. Okay, so an auditor will often select specific items for examination with regards to, okay, these are the following where instances where specific item selecting is being used by the auditor. Okay, first, there is high value or key items. So normally, if the auditor, based on his professional judgment, okay, he will only select these types of accounts with high value or considered to be key items, or those which he thinks that is material. Okay, so only those items will be evaluated for him to gather sufficient appropriate audit evidences. Okay. Another is all items over a certain amount. Okay, so for example, he will set the materiality level at 100,000. So for those account balances above or from 100,000 and above, only those items will be subject to testing, okay, for evaluation in the gathering of audit evidence. Okay, another items to obtain information. So, meaning based on his audit procedure and audit planning. So, there are specific areas in which the auditor can get information that will support his opinion later on. Okay, but of course, this is dependent on the level of risk of material misstatement, okay, that the auditor has preliminarily determined as well. Another items to test for a certain procedures, just like what we have mentioned earlier about internal control, okay, or test of controls where the auditor can do the sampling. Okay, so he may not perform 100% evaluation. So this is what we are talking about, okay, in relation to internal control. Okay, so selecting specific items, this method is somewhat subjective and it may result to an increased level of non-sampling risk. Meaning, this is based on the professional judgment of the auditor, and but although there is considered to be a valid basis, but it is uh, it is sometimes considered to be subjective, because in this case, the auditor will just select a portion of the population to test or evaluate. So in that case, it will have, or it will increase the level of non-sampling risk. What is non-sampling risk? Meaning those items which were not uh, included in the evaluation may include a material misstatement, but because the auditor did not include them in the sampling test, so he or the auditor was not able to detect such misstatement. So that is the risk there, okay, in sampling or selecting specific items. Whereas for a 100% selection or evaluation, everything is uh, evaluated, okay, in contrast to that. So another is audit sampling, okay. By the way, selecting specific items is somewhat different with the audit sampling, although they can be related, but in the specific selecting specific items here, the auditor determines a certain class of transaction, account balance, or disclosure to evaluate. Whereas in sampling, in this case, we have the population, and then the auditor will follow the methods for audit sampling to select what items to include in the evaluation. Meaning, the auditor did not specifically determine what item. The item is determined by the result of the audit sampling technique selection. Okay, so this is the difference between selecting specific items and the audit sampling. Okay, so this is the third means of selecting items for testing. So in audit sampling, this involves the application of audit procedure, which is less than 100%. So within a population, okay, so such that all sampling units have a chance of selection in order to provide the auditor with a reasonable basis on which to draw conclusions about the entire population. So basically in sampling, the samples that is taken from the population will represent, okay, the population. Although not everything was subject to evaluation, but this amount of sample is enough to represent the whole population. So that is the rationale, okay, behind sampling. That's why it is allowed as a means, okay, in selecting items for testing. So in this case, for audit sampling, when we say population, okay, so this refers to the entire set of data, okay, in which the sample will be taken or selected and about which the auditor wishes to draw a conclusion. Okay, so that is what we mean by population, the entire class of transaction, account balance, or disclosure. But in this case, the auditor will just select a number, okay, of items to be included in the sample for evaluation. So a sampling unit, so this is defined as the individual items constituting a population. When we say sampling unit, for example, a class of transactions for asset accounts. So the cash account is considered to be a sampling unit, which is part of all the asset accounts. Okay, so this is the individual item, okay, that constitute the population. So sampling, this is a process of selecting a subset. So when we say subset, this is a smaller portion, okay, of the whole. For the purpose of this is to make inference to the whole population, meaning this sample is enough to represent the population, okay, when they are subjected to evaluation. So whatever the result of the evaluation from this sample will also be the same result, okay. This is the premise of sampling. Okay, whatever the result from the evaluation from the sample, this will also be the same result when the whole population is being evaluated. Okay, that is the premise of sampling. So this is how to make inference, okay, using sample to the whole population. So accounting population. So this usually consists of a large number of items. Okay, so there are different transactions, okay, account and disclosures. So usually this is a large number of items. Often, for example, in terms of amounts, so they total more or less to millions of pesos, and a detailed or 100% examination of all of this account is almost impossible. Okay, because again, auditing or audit engagement is just for a period of time only, and the longer the auditor will spend in performing his audit evidence, the client will also pay for that amount of time that is being spent by the auditor. So that's why it is limited by the time, okay, in performing the audit procedures. So in this case, evaluating this in this circumstance will be impractical or impossible. Okay, so audit sampling can be used in the test of controls, okay, as we have mentioned earlier, and as well as in the substantive procedures. But in the substantive procedures, the auditor can also do 100% examination if that is practicable. Okay. So in relation to the substantive procedures, however, sampling can only be used in performing test of details. Okay, so because substantive analytical procedure should be applied to a complete set. Okay, so this is where the 100% examination will be applied. Okay, so because in this case, this information will confirm, okay, or will confirm, or sometimes it may defile the relationships generated by computing ratios and trend analysis. Okay, the auditor will know if these are realistic. Okay, so that's why 100% evaluation should be performed. Okay, furthermore, audit sampling is not used for the following. So this is not applicable if the auditor will use inquiry and observation. So, for example, the auditor will interview employees to obtain understanding of the entity system of internal control, or obtaining written representation from the management. So, in this case, the auditor should at least read every single detail, okay, to help him understand such things. So, in this case, for inquiry and observation, audit sampling is not applied or is not applicable. Next, audit sampling is also not used for test of controls where application is not documented. Of course, if there is no audit trail, meaning the auditor cannot draw anything, okay, to be used as a sample. There is no data. So basically, audit sampling is not applicable. Another is procedures applied to every item in the population. So in this case, since the procedures are applied to every item, meaning 100% examination was provided. Okay, so audit sampling is not basically used, okay, in this case. And procedures from which the auditor does not intend to extend a conclusion to the remaining items in the account. So of course, if for example, in the population, there are items where the auditor will not extend a conclusion, or he will not include that as part of the scope of the audit, as also discussed with the management. So in that case, the auditor cannot draw a sample, because if he will do it, he might include in the sample those items which is not part, okay, of his scope or responsibilities. That's why only those items which are included in the scope should be evaluated or tested. Okay, so those are the things in which the auditor can select, or those are the different procedures in which the auditor can select different means, okay, of selecting items for testing, okay, in the gathering of his appropriate and sufficient audit evidence to support the opinion on the fairness of the financial statements of the client. So he can do 100% examination, specific item selection, and he can also do the audit sampling. Okay.